My parents, Damon and Sable Voss, raised me in a house where doubt sat at the table every single night like an uninvited guest. My mother kept a green recipe box on the kitchen counter that never opened for anything but my brother's favorite dishes. My father drank his coffee black, from the same chipped white mug, at exactly 6 in the morning. And he read the newspaper like the rest of us weren't in the room. I used to think that was just how they were built, until I found out exactly how far it went. Let me start from the beginning. My name is Rosalind Voss. I'm 32 now, and I run a consulting firm's Chicago office out of a corner suite on the 19th floor. People who meet me today assume I came from a home that believed in me. They see the office, the title on the door, and they fill in the rest with something warm. The truth is colder than that. I grew up in Millbrook, Illinois, in a brick two-story on Larkspur Lane with a mailbox my father repainted every spring. My younger brother, Alden, got the front bedroom with the good light. I got the one over the garage, where the floor creaked if you stepped in the wrong spot. If I brought home a 98 on a test, my father would say the test must have been easy. If I finished a science project 3 weeks early, my mother would say anyone could manage that with enough free time. Alden never had to earn anything. He could leave his shoes in the middle of the hallway, and my mother would laugh and call him her sunshine. I learned to step around the shoes without saying a word. There was one person in that house who saw me. My grandmother, Ellery Doyle, my mother's mother, lived 2 streets over in a little rental with a porch swing that squeaked in the wind. She used to sit me down at her kitchen table with a cup of cocoa and a blue spiral notebook, and she'd tap the cover with one finger. "Write it down," she'd say. "Every bit of it. The good and the bad. People forget things on purpose, Rosalind. Paper doesn't." I still have that notebook. I kept it in the drawer of my desk at the consulting firm for years before I finally understood why she'd given it to me. She died the spring I turned 11. My mother cried at the funeral, but by the following week she was back to reorganizing the recipe box like nothing had happened. I kept writing things down anyway. That's the part of me nobody at the Voss dinner table ever saw coming. The quiet kid with the notebook became the woman who reads a balance sheet the way other people read a room, who notices the number that doesn't match 3 columns before anyone else does. But that came later. Back then, I was just a girl standing in a kitchen doorway, watching my parents talk about my brother's bright future, like I wasn't standing 3 feet away. I wanted, just once, to hear them say they were proud of me. That moment never came in that house. Not when I was young enough to still expect it. I stopped waiting for it. I made myself a promise instead. Sitting on the edge of my bed one night with the blue notebook open on my knees. One day I would build a life no one in that house could shrink. I didn't know yet what that life would look like. I just knew I'd write down every step of getting there. By high school, I'd stopped expecting compliments at home. I told myself results would be different. Results, I thought, were harder to argue with than a report card. So I studied on the back porch after Alden went to bed, under a yellow bug light that hummed if you sat under it too long. I joined every academic team that would have me. I filled out scholarship applications at the kitchen table after my parents went upstairs, working by the light over the stove because I didn't want to explain what I was doing. My teachers noticed. Mr. Halloran, who taught AP statistics, told me twice that I had a mind built for numbers most people never bothered to check. Coming from him, that landed somewhere real. Coming from my parents, nothing landed at all. Senior year, the offers started arriving. For schools. 2 with partial scholarships, 1 full ride from a university 2 states away. I remember standing in the front hall with the acceptance letter from Belhaven University still warm from the printer, waiting for my mother to look up from the stove. She read it. She set it on the counter next to the recipe box. "That's nice, Rosalind," she said, and went back to stirring. My father glanced at it over dinner and asked if the scholarship covered books, then changed the subject to Alden's baseball tryouts before I could answer. I sat there with my fork in my hand and told myself they were just tired. I had a whole drawer of excuses for them by then, and I reached for one without even thinking. You know that feeling when you've been patient so long that patience itself starts to feel like a mistake. I didn't have that feeling yet. Not fully. That came later. What I had instead was one strange, unexpected week where things got warmer. A few days after the acceptance letters, my mother came home with a bakery box, not a grocery store cake, and set it on the table without being asked. My father mentioned the scholarship to a neighbor on the sidewalk, loud enough for me to hear through the screen door. And something in his voice sounded almost like pride. For the first time in longer than I could remember, dinner didn't feel like a room I had to survive. I let myself believe it might last. I even stopped carrying the blue notebook around the house that week. I left it in my desk drawer and told myself I didn't need it as much anymore. I should have kept it closer. Because 2 weeks later, I asked a simple question about the college savings account my grandmother had quietly helped start for me years before she died. The account my parents had managed ever since. My mother's face changed before she said a single word. And that was the last easy dinner I had in that house. I asked about the balance because Bellhaven's financial aid office needed a number by Friday. My mother wiped her hands on a dish towel that didn't need wiping. My father set down his coffee mug harder than the moment called for. "There's been a change," he said. I didn't move. He told me the account was empty. Every dollar my grandmother had helped put aside gone. He said it the way you'd report the weather, flat and final. I asked where it went. My mother looked at the recipe box instead of at me and said Alden had needed it. He'd tried starting a lawn care business the summer before, bought a used mower and a trailer with money he didn't have, and when the whole thing collapsed by August, someone had to cover what he owed. That someone turned out to be me. Without my knowledge. Without my name on a single piece of paper giving anyone permission. I asked why they hadn't talked to me first. My father looked me straight in the eye. "Alden has more potential than you," he said. This was the better investment. My mother didn't correct him. She just nodded, the way you'd agree that the sky was blue. I felt the floor tilt a little. Right there on the linoleum I'd walked across 1,000 times. I reminded them I'd earned 4 scholarship offers on my own. I reminded them that money had been meant for tuition and books and a dorm room 2 states away. Not for a mower my brother left rusting in the garage by September. They didn't apologize. My mother said successful people didn't complain. That family helps family. And I remember thinking, even then, that the rule only ever seemed to run in one direction in that house. That night I went up to my room over the garage and pulled the blue notebook out of my desk drawer. I opened it to a clean page and wrote down the date, the amount, and the exact words my father had used. I didn't cry while I wrote it. I just wrote it, letter by letter, until my hand cramped. I packed one suitcase before I went to bed. Small enough to carry on a bus. There is a difference between being patient and being a placeholder. I didn't understand that yet, not fully, but I understood it a little more than I had that morning. The next morning, I called Bellhaven's financial aid office from the payphone outside the Millbrook Library and asked what my options were without the family contribution they'd been counting on. There were options. Fewer than I wanted. Enough to get me through the door. I spent the next 2 weeks working extra shifts at the diner on Route 9 where I'd bussed tables since I was 15. I said nothing to my parents about what I'd decided. I just kept showing up for my shift, kept coming home, kept setting the table like nothing had shifted underneath all of us. My grandmother used to say that some conversations aren't worth having twice. I finally understood what she meant. The morning I left for Bellhaven, there were no hugs waiting by the door. No one offered to help carry my suitcase to the bus stop on Fenner Street. My father was already at the kitchen table with his newspaper. My mother was rinsing a mug in the sink. I said goodbye anyway. My mother said to call when I landed at school, the same way she might remind me to buy milk on the way home. I closed the front door behind me with one clear thought in my head. If I wanted a different life, I was going to have to build it myself. Without the 2 people who were supposed to want that for me more than anyone. College didn't get easier once I got there. My reduced aid package covered tuition and not much beyond it. I found a job at a coffee shop 3 blocks from campus. and a second one shelving returns in the university library 4 nights a week. I was up before 6 and rarely in bed before 1 in the morning. There were weeks I skipped dinner to keep enough set aside for textbooks. I never told my roommate, a bright, easygoing girl named Ellery, sharing my grandmother's name. And I sometimes wondered if that was why I trusted her the way I did. I called home maybe once a month, more out of habit than hope. The calls rarely lasted 5 minutes. My parents asked if I was eating enough in the way people ask about whether they don't actually care about. They mentioned more than once that I'd probably burn out before graduation. That Bellhaven was likely too much for someone like me. I hung up those calls and sat on the edge of my dorm bed for a while, not moving. Then I opened the blue notebook and wrote down what they'd said, word for word, the same way I'd been doing since I was 11 years old. Their doubt stopped being something that hurt me somewhere around the start of my second year. It became something closer to fuel. Every exam I passed felt like a line item proving them wrong, even though none of them were there to read it. I graduated on a warm Saturday in May with no family in the crowd. I stood with my roommate's parents for the photos afterward because they insisted, and I let them, because some kindness is worth accepting even when it isn't yours by right. A week later, I packed my one suitcase again and took a bus to Chicago, where a growing consulting firm had offered me an entry-level position that most people my age would have considered small. I didn't think it was small. I thought it was a door. I had no idea yet how far that door would open. Chicago tested me in a different way than college had. I was the newest hire in an office where everyone else had gone to schools I'd never heard mentioned at my own kitchen table. I didn't try to impress anyone with words. I got in before 8, stayed after most people left, and volunteered for the assignments nobody else wanted to touch. When I made a mistake, I said so out loud and fixed it before anyone had to ask twice. My manager, a soft-spoken man named Gideon Marsh, noticed I stayed level when deadlines got ugly. He started pulling me into meetings that weren't technically mine to attend. Within 2 years I had my first promotion. Within 4 my second. By the time I turned 29, I was running the Midwest division out of a corner office on the 19th floor. The one with the good afternoon light. The kind of office I used to imagine when I was writing in a blue notebook by a bug light on a back porch. I never called home to announce any of it. I'd stopped expecting anyone on Larkspur Lane to ask. Through my aunt, I heard pieces about Alden over the years. Another job, another plan, another thing that fell apart that was never quite his fault. According to my parents, it was always the market, or a bad partner, or bad timing. Never him. I listened without arguing. I'd learned that some people won't see a thing even when it's standing directly in front of them. Then, on a Thursday evening in March, my phone rang while I was still at my desk. I saw my mother's name on the screen, and nearly let it go to voicemail. Something made me pick up. Her voice was warmer than I remembered it being in years. She said she'd missed me. My father got on a minute later and asked how Chicago was treating me, like it was a place he'd wondered about. Before we hung up, they asked if I'd come to dinner. Said they wanted to reconnect as a family. Part of me wanted to believe that. Another part of me, the part that still carried a blue notebook in a desk drawer, felt something tighten in my chest that had nothing to do with hope. I agreed anyway. I told myself I'd know soon enough which part of me was right. We met at a quiet restaurant on the north side the following Saturday. My parents were already seated when I arrived, and they stood to hug me like it was something we did all the time. They asked about my apartment, my health, whether I'd made friends in the city. They never once asked what my job actually was. By the time the plates were cleared, my father cleared his throat the way he used to before delivering bad news over that same kitchen table on Larkspur Lane. He said Alden had started another business a year earlier. Said it had gone well at first, and then it hadn't. Said the debts had grown bigger than anyone expected, and creditors were starting to call. My mother reached across the table and rested her hand on mine. "You have such a nice little job now," she said. "We thought maybe you could help. Talk to someone. A loan, an investment, anything." Neither of them asked if I wanted to be involved. They simply assumed I would be. the same way they'd once assumed my college fund belonged to whoever needed it more. I sat there for a moment, quiet, turning the truth over in my mind like a coin. They hadn't called because they'd missed me. They called because they needed something. I smiled, told them I'd think it over, and asked my father to bring Alden's paperwork to my office the following Tuesday morning. I gave him the address on a slip of paper I'd already written out before I left my apartment that morning. He looked pleased. My mother thanked me 3 times before we said goodbye. They had no idea I'd already made up my mind. I got to the office earlier than usual that Tuesday, the way I had almost every day since I was 22 years old. Around 10, the receptionist called up to say my guests had arrived. I asked her to send them up. Later she told me they'd stood in the lobby a long moment, looking up at the ceiling, at the company name etched into the wall behind the front desk. She said my father had asked, quietly, if this was the right building. An assistant met them at the elevator. I watched later, through the glass wall of my office as they stepped off on the 19th floor, and went still. My assistant walked them to my door and opened it. I was behind my desk, finishing a line on a report, and I looked up and smiled the way I would for any visitor. Neither of them moved for several seconds. My father's eyes went to the nameplate on my desk, then back to my face, like he was checking the two against each other, and they still didn't add up. My mother said my name so quietly I almost didn't hear it. I stood, walked around the desk, and shook their hands. There's been a mistake, my father said. We were told to come to Rosalind Voss's office. There's no mistake, I said. You're exactly where you're supposed to be. I told them I was the division head. I watched that land on both of their faces at once, and for the first time in my life, they weren't looking down at me. They were looking up. I let them sit. I let the silence stretch a moment longer than it needed to, not out of cruelty, but because some silences are the only honest thing left in a room. My mother recovered first. She said she'd always known I would do well. I felt something in my chest go very still and very cold, hearing that. When exactly did you believe in me? I asked. Neither of them answered. I reminded them of the account. I said the exact words my father had used at that kitchen table. The ones I'd written down in blue ink the same night he'd said them. Alden has more potential than you. This was the better investment. My father's jaw tightened, but he didn't argue the memory. I reminded them of the graduation they never came to. How I'd stood at the edge of the ceremony afterward waiting by the doors until the lot outside had mostly emptied. My mother said, quietly, that parenting was hard. That they'd made mistakes. I told her I understood that everyone makes mistakes. What I didn't understand, I said, was choosing the same mistake, the same child, over and over for 20 years. The office was very quiet after that. My father brought the conversation back around to Alden's debts. The reason they'd actually come. My mother said this was a chance for the family to come together again. I folded my hands on the desk and told them I'd already reviewed the numbers Alden had sent over. The losses weren't bad luck. They were the result of decisions made without a plan, over and over, by someone who had never once had to sit with the consequences of a decision in his life. I told them I couldn't invest my company's money, or my own name in that. My father said family should help family. I told him real help isn't the same thing as rescuing someone from every consequence they've earned. My mother asked if I was doing this out of revenge. I shook my head. Revenge, I told her, would have looked like using this office to make them feel small. That was never why I'd asked them to come. I'd asked them to come because I wanted them to finally see who I actually was, not the version of me they'd decided on 20 years ago in a kitchen on Larkspur Lane. They didn't have an answer for that. I don't think they'd expected to need one. I walked them to the door myself. I told them I hoped things worked out for Alden, and I meant it. I wasn't carrying anger out of that room. Anger only keeps old pain warm. And I'd spent too many years building something to let it live there rent-free. As the door closed behind them, I understood something I hadn't let myself see clearly before. The Real win was never the office, or the title on the nameplate. It was standing in that room, and making the right choice without letting 20 years of doubt make it for me. A few weeks passed before my phone rang again. This time it was Alden. We hadn't spoken in over a year, not really, not beyond a text on a birthday. I almost let it go to voicemail out of habit. His voice sounded different than I remembered. Quieter. He didn't ask about money. He asked if I had time for coffee. We met at a small place near my office, a shop with mismatched chairs and a chalkboard menu that hadn't been updated in weeks. He looked tired in a way I hadn't seen on him before, older around the eyes than a man in his late 20s should look. He sat across from me for a while without saying much. Then he told me something I never expected to hear. He said our parents had spent his whole life catching him before he hit the ground. Every failed plan, every unpaid bill, someone had always stepped in before he had to face what he'd actually caused. He said he was starting to understand that none of that had ever been help. It had just been a way of making sure he never learned how to stand up on his own. I didn't say anything for a moment. I let him sit in it the way I'd learned to sit in things myself, on a back porch, under a bug light, years ago. He thanked me for saying no in that office. Said it was the first time in his life anyone had let him actually feel the weight of something he'd caused. I told him I hoped he'd land on his feet. I meant it. We didn't fix everything over one cup of coffee. Some things take longer than that. But it was the first honest conversation we'd had since we were kids splitting a bedroom wall on Larkspur Lane. And I didn't take that lightly. In the weeks that followed, my parents started calling more, but the calls were different now. Less asking, more apologizing. My mother said she wished she could go back and do things differently. My father admitted, in his own clipped way, that they'd been unfair to me for a long time. I told them I accepted the apology. I meant that too. Carrying that weight forever would only ever cost me, not them. But I also told them accepting an apology and going back to how things used to be were two different things. Trust isn't rebuilt in a single phone call. Ours had taken 20 years to wear down, and it would take longer than a season of Sunday calls to earn back. We talk now from time to time. Not often. Enough. Looking back now, there's a version of this story where I spent my whole life trying to make two people see me, and never stopped long enough to notice I already had. I still keep the blue notebook my grandmother gave me. It sits in the second drawer of my desk, on the 19th floor, next to a stapler and a spare set of keys. I don't write in it as often these days. I don't need to the way I used to. But every so often, when a new hire walks into my office looking the way I probably looked at 22, unsure whether they belong in the room they're standing in, I think of her. Write it down, she used to say. People forget things on purpose. Paper doesn't. I've started mentoring some of the newer employees here, the ones who remind me of myself. A few came from homes like mine. Others just carry a version of the same doubt, put there by someone who should have known better. I don't tell them what to do. I just remind them that someone else's opinion was never the whole truth about who they'd become. My parents visited the office one more time, a few months after that Tuesday morning, this time without an ask attached to it. My mother brought a small potted plant for my desk. My father looked around the office a long moment and said, quietly, that he was proud of what I'd built. I let myself hear it, this time, without needing it to undo the past. It didn't erase 20 years. It didn't need to. I don't know if our family will ever be what people picture when they say that word. I've stopped measuring my life against that particular hope. What I have instead is peace. A life I built one shift, one exam, one quiet decision at a time, without anyone's permission. If there's one thing I hope you take from this, it's this. Your past does not get the final word on your future. Write it down if you have to. Keep every proof of what you survived. And keep building, even on the days nobody in the room is cheering for you. Sometimes the quietest kind of justice isn't proving someone wrong out of anger. It's simply becoming the person they never believed you could be.